Welcome to History in the Shadow. I am your host, Shaho. That is all that stood between 30,000 soldiers and the complete destruction of Japan. Not 80,000. Not 800. 80. The number of people who might attend a small wedding. On one side, a 67-year-old commander named Sosukuni, standing on a beach in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the horizon. Behind him, villages sleeping. Fishermen, farmers, families who have never seen war in their lives. On the other side, 900 ships materializing from the darkness like a slow-moving nightmare. 30,000 soldiers packed onto those decks. Mongols, Koreans, Chinese, Urchins, the army of the largest empire in human history, an army that had already conquered half the known world. And between them, 80 samurai on a beach. This is not the story the video game told you. This is what actually happened on Tsushima Island on November 4, 1274. And what the Mongols did in the days that followed is so brutal, so calculated, so methodically horrifying that every samurai legend you have ever heard sounds like a fairy tale by comparison. This is the real story. So let's start the main story, and don't forget to follow and subscribe. Thank you. Thank you. So understand what hit Tsushima that November morning, you need to understand what the Mongol Empire was in 1274. 12 million square miles. From Poland to Korea. From Siberia to Syria. 1/4 of the entire land surface of the earth, under the control of a single ruling family. The largest empire in the history of human civilization. Genghis Khan had died in 1227. But his grandson Kublai had taken the project even further. By 1274, Kublai Khan controlled China, the most populous civilization on Earth. He controlled Korea so completely that Korean ships would form the backbone of his invasion fleet. And Kublai Khan wanted Japan. It's not because Japan had attacked him, not because Japan posed any threat, because Japan had refused to bow. In 1266, Kublai sent diplomats to Japan with a simple message. Submit. Become a vassal state. Acknowledge Mongol supremacy. Japan's response was silence. They did not even reply. Kublai sent more envoys in 1268. Japan's military government, the Kamakura shogunate, considered the letter an insult. They drafted a response, then decided not to send it. Why waste words on barbarians? When Kublai's diplomats arrived in 1271, Japanese samurai met them at the shore, armed and hostile. The Mongol delegation was placed under military custody and told to leave and never return. One diplomat named Zhao Liangbi waited 2 years for a response that never came. When he returned to China in 1273, he told Kublai that the Japanese were not worth conquering, that invading those islands would waste the empire's resources. One diplomat named Zhao Liangbi waited 2 years for a response that never came. When he returned to China in 1273, he told Kublai that the Japanese were not worth conquering, that invading those islands would waste the empire's resources. Tsushima Island sits in the Korea Strait, halfway between Korea and Japan. Green, mountainous, covered in dense forest. Population, perhaps 5,000 people. Fishermen, farmers, merchant. The island's entire military force was 80 mounted samurai. If you counted every peasant who could hold a weapon, you might reach 200 men total against 30,000. The entire population of Tsushima would not fill a modern football stadium, and the force sailing toward it was larger than most medieval European armies ever assembled for any purpose. This was not going to be a battle. It was extermination with a schedule. The commander of those 80 samurai was Sosukuni, 67 years old, deputy governor for 12 years, a man who had spent his entire life protecting these shores. He had sent messengers to the mainland requesting reinforcements. None arrived in time. This was not going to be a battle. It was extermination with a schedule. The commander of those 80 samurai was Sosukuni. He did everything correctly. By every rule of warfare he knew. The problem was that the Mongols were playing an entirely different game. He did everything correctly. By every rule of warfare he knew. The problem was that the Mongols were playing an entirely different game. You announced yourself. You stated your purpose. You gave your enemy the opportunity to respond with dignity. The Mongols responded with arrows. Before the small boat reached the first ship, the volleys began. 2 samurai were dead before they could turn around. One survivor collapsed over his oar with an arrow through his throat. No negotiation. No protocols. No acknowledgement that the rules of civilized warfare applied here. As the sun rose, the samurai saw the full scale of what they faced. The fleet was not landing at one point. It was landing everywhere simultaneously, north, south, in the strait between Tsushima's 2 main islands. No defensive position could cover them all. No negotiation. No protocols. No acknowledgement that the rules of civilized warfare applied here. As the sun rose, the samurai saw the full scale of what they faced. The fleet was not landing at one point. It was landing everywhere simultaneously, north, south, in the strait between Tsushima's 2 main islands. No defensive position could cover them all. Samurai loosed their arrows. The Mongols raised shields, portable shields carried individually as they advanced. The Japanese had no equivalent. Seeing infantry advance behind mobile protection, moving in coordinated formations, responding to drums and gongs. This was something from another world entirely. Then the Mongols returned fire, not individual archers choosing targets. Coordinated volleys, entire units releasing simultaneously on command. The arrows came so thick that Japanese chronicles described them as falling as heavy as rain. And some of those arrows were poisoned. A scratch meant death. Even a glancing wound became fatal within hours. And then came the sound that the samurai of Tsushima had never heard in their lives. Thunder. But from the ground, not the sky. Japanese accounts from multiple sources describe it identically. A noise like thunder. A flash like lightning. Iron objects that shook heaven and earth when they exploded. Bombs. The Mongols were using gunpowder weapons. The Nihon Kokujokushi, written around 1300, calls them fire tubes. Archibald's coast found spherical iron vessels packed with gunpowder and scrap bombs. Shrapnel bombs. The Chinese called them thunder crash bombs. Imagine being a samurai on that beach. You have trained your entire life with sword and bow. You understand warfare as a contest of individual skill and courage. You know exactly what an arrow feels like in flight, how a sword cuts, how cavalry charges work. Then something explodes next to you with a force that ruptures your eardrums. Your horse panics, rearing and throwing you. Men around you are screaming, bleeding from wounds they cannot see, shredded by metal fragments moving faster than arrows. The bombs did not just kill. They broke morale. They destroyed the psychological foundation that samurai warfare was built on. There is no skill that deflects shrapnel. But Sukuni did not retreat. One samurai named Sukesada, surrounded by Mongol soldiers on every side, cut down 25 enemy soldiers in personal hand-to-hand combat. Sword to sword. 25 men. This is documented in the clan chronicle, written by people who were there. It made no difference. By afternoon, the Mongols had established beachheads everywhere simultaneously. The entire doctrine that Sukuni's samurai had trained for was useless against coordinated infantry, poisoned arrows, and gunpowder bombs. As the sun fell, Sukuni organized one final cavalry charge. 80 mounted samurai. Everything they had. Charging directly into a force that outnumbered them 375 to 1. Every single one of them died. Sukuni, his sons, his retainers, his entire force, cut down in the darkness by arrows they never saw coming and explosions that shredded horses and riders together. 80 mounted samurai. Everything they had. Charging directly into a force that outnumbered them 375 to 1. Every single one of them died. Villages burned. Every structure near Komoda Beach was reduced to ash. The Mongols torched homes while families were still inside. Survivors who fled into the mountains were hunted by cavalry units specifically sent to eliminate any resistance. Women were taken captive. What happened to them is what happened in every territory the Mongol Empire conquered through violence. Systematic brutality, deliberately designed to break the population's will to resist. And then came the detail that Japanese fishermen would remember for the rest of their lives. Some prisoners were threaded through the palms of their hands with wire, driven through living flesh, and hung alive from the sides of Mongol ships, left hanging as the fleet sailed toward its next targets. A warning to every coastal community that would see those ships pass. This is what resistance costs. This is the price of defiance. Japanese fishermen reported ships with people hanging from their sides, screaming, begging for a death that would not come for hours or days. This was not chaos. This was a calculated message, delivered in the most horrifying terms possible. Submit. Or this. The Mongol fleet moved on to Iki Island, which fell even faster. Then toward Kyushu, Japan's main island. At Hakata Bay, Japan's mainland samurai finally fought back. They abandoned individual combat doctrine and adopted more coordinated tactics. They inflicted real casualties. The Mongol fleet moved on to Iki Island, which fell even faster. Then toward Kyushu, Japan's main island. At Hakata Bay, Japan's mainland samurai finally fought back. They abandoned individual combat doctrine and adopted more coordinated tactics. They inflicted real casualties. Paper. The Mongol fleet, packed into the exposed bay, was devastated. Hundreds of ships sank. Thousands of soldiers drowned. The greatest naval force medieval Asia had ever assembled was broken in a single night. The Japanese had a name for this storm. Kamikaze. The divine wind. 550 years after Tsushima, Japan called its World War II suicide pilots kamikaze, invoking the divine winds that had saved the islands from the Mongols. The ghost of 1274 lived in Japan's military identity for 7 centuries. The 80 samurai of Komoda Beach did not stop the Mongol invasion. They forced the Mongols to spend 3 days on Tsushima rather than pushing immediately toward Hakata Bay. And in warfare, time is everything. Whether those 3 days changed the final outcome, historians still debate this. The storms would have come regardless. But the samurai of Tsushima could not have known that storms were coming. They stood on that beach in the pre-dawn darkness of November 4th, 1274, watching 900 ships come out of the night, knowing exactly what their own survival chances were, and they stood there anyway. So Sukune sent his 4 men forward in that small boat, trying to find some path that did not end in the death of everyone behind him. The arrows that met them before they could speak were not just arrows. They were the announcement that the world Sukune understood was over. A new world had arrived on those 900 ships. Sukune organized his cavalry charge anyway. 80 men against 30,000. He knew the mathematics. He had eyes. He could count the ships. He charged anyway. Because that is what the code demanded. Because the fishermen sleeping in the villages behind him had trusted him with their lives. Because retreat was not something the warrior tradition he had been raised and recognized as honorable when the alternative was leaving those villages to what was coming. Every single one of them died. And the villages burned anyway. And Japan survived. The divine wind came. The fleet sank. The empire that had conquered half the known world sailed away from Japan's shores and never came back. Every single one of them died. And the villages burned anyway. And Japan survived. The divine wind came. The fleet sank. The empire that had conquered half the known world sailed away from Japan's shores and never came back.